One thing we can agree on is that you can't not be on a diet. You can opt out of surgery, you can not take your meds, but you got to eat something. You can't not be on a diet. So the question is there a best diet for everybody, for general health? Well, everybody's different, and the best diet for you may be different from the best diet for the next guy. But is there a default diet? In other words, the one that you would try first, and if it doesn't work, you can try something else. So the case for carbohydrate restriction as the default diet comes from the idea of the metabolic syndrome. This is actually a very important intellectual idea. We're used to the idea that seemingly superficially different phenomena are tied to a single underlying physiologic state. And these include overweight, high blood glucose, high insulin, low HDL, high small dense LDL, high triglycerides. These three together, 4, 5, and 6, are referred to as atherogenic dyslipidemia. And finally, high blood pressure. So again, they're superficially fairly different, but in fact, they are observed to appear together, and there is the idea that they may reflect a common metabolic state. What's interesting about this list is if you now made a list of those physiologic phenomena that are improved by carbohydrate restriction, it's the same list. So we actually asked whether this was really demonstrable in the literature, and we went through the literature and looked at all the studies where high carbohydrate and low carbohydrate diets were compared under isocaloric conditions. We published this. Well, this is modern science. People don't have time to even read the abstract, so we put all the information in the title. Carbohydrate restriction improves the features of metabolic syndrome. And it occurred to us that this may actually be a definition. If you want to know whether your patient has metabolic syndrome, see if you can reduce all the symptoms with a low carbohydrate diet. Here's the data. And you can see this is a comparison of a large number of different studies. They all have slightly different protocols. But the light blue indicates those cases where the features of metabolic syndrome are improved by carbohydrate restriction. The two pink boxes indicate specific markers where in those studies the low-fat diet did better. Jeff Volek did a prospective study based on this, and what he found is that if you look first at weight loss, now this is a 12-week prospective study with 40 subjects. They all fit the definition of metabolic syndrome. That is, officially you have to have at least 3 of the markers that I indicated on the previous slide. So the low carbohydrate diet was a fairly low carbohydrate, 12% carbohydrate. And the low fat diet had a fairly high percentage. And what you can see is that after 12 weeks, the people on the low carbohydrate diet lost substantially more weight than the people on the low fat diet. And it's not just the averages, it's that the individual people did better, and in fact, almost half of the people on the low carbohydrate diet did better than anybody on the low fat diet, and the average on the low carbohydrate diet was about equal to the guy who did best on the low fat diet. Now, these of course depend on dietary recall, and it's well known that there's lots of errors, but these are big differences, and so dietary recall errors may play into it. But remember, for dietary recall to explain this, it has to be that the people in the low carbohydrate diet overestimated what they ate, and or the people in the low fat diet have to underestimate what they eat, or both. So on the face of it, it might be good to be on a diet where you think you're eating too much. So these are the markers of atherogenic dyslipidemia, and you can see there's a tremendous reduction in triglycerides. This is actually the most outstanding feature of low carbohydrate diets. It's been known in the literature since the 1950s, and you can see that not only did everybody do better, but the people who did best are the people who had the very highest levels of triglyceride. They did pretty well on the low-fat diet too. So calorie reduction, of course, will improve triglyceride levels, especially in those people who have triglycerides. But you can see you're much better off with a low-carb diet than with a low-fat diet. Similarly, for the so-called good cholesterol, HDL, most people did much better. And certainly on average it was much better than on the low-fat diet. This is actually true for all of the markers. It's true for the small dense LDL. So in this particular study, LDL, which is the marker that most clinicians want to look at, the LDL didn't actually change between the two diets. However, the small LDL, which is generally considered to be more atherogenic, was much better improved by the low-carb diet than the low-fat diet. Also true is the saturated fat. So what you're looking at here is the actual saturated fat found in the plasma of people on low-carb diet versus low-fat diet, despite the fact that the people on the low-carb diet were taking in 3 times the amount of saturated fat as the people on the low-fat diet. So this is one of the most dramatic indications that you are not what you eat. In particular, you are not the saturated fat that you eat. One of the conclusions you might make from this, if you think about it, is on a low-fat diet, you may actually be on a high saturated fat diet because your body is making saturated fat. Now, not everybody buys into the metabolic syndrome. People say that there's no report that the data showing the risk imparted by the syndrome is higher than the risk imparted by the component factors. So that's important because if you want to make a diagnosis based on the syndrome, you need to know whether it's a real thing. And our argument is that carbohydrate restriction targets all the markers of metabolic syndrome, whereas drugs target individual markers. And that's what Kahn meant when he said that there's no evidence for a unique effect of the total syndrome because each of the markers would be treated with a different drug. You don't have to read this slide. The point is simply that all drugs have side effects. There's no evidence that carbohydrate restriction is going to have any significant side effect, at least comparable to drug interaction. So the fact that all of these things are targeted by one intervention, namely carbohydrate restriction, speaks to the fact that it really is a syndrome, that there really is an underlying metabolic state. So what's the problem? Well, the risk in overweight, of course, is obesity, and the risk of high blood glucose is diabetes. The atherogenic dyslipidemia, of course, leads to cardiovascular disease. So how do you treat this? Well, there are a million ways to lose weight, especially if you're young. And the truth is we don't really know what causes cardiovascular disease. Again, the summary of the beneficial effects experimentally suggests that carbohydrate restriction is as good as anything. But in the end, in terms of basic science, we don't understand cardiovascular disease. We do know how to treat diabetes. The American Diabetes Association doesn't know. Many physicians don't know, but it's obvious that the best way to treat a disease of carbohydrate intolerance is to keep carbohydrate as low as possible. Here's the pitch. We can show there's the best treatment for diabetes, and it's one that also improves obesity and cardiovascular disease. And if metabolic syndrome is a real thing, that is, if it's about common mechanisms, then we have the default diet. we have the one to try first. So on the next show, I'm going to tell you what the evidence is that diabetes is best treated by carbohydrate restriction.